This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Ian Dale.
Hello, very good evening. It's 9:03 on LBC. I'm Ian Dale. It's time for our Monday night panel. Something that I'm keen to do is not just talk about COVID and not just talk about Brexit at the moment, because obviously those are the two things that dominate our lives, dominate our discussions. But, you know, sometimes it's good to have a little break, and that's what we're going to do over the next hour. And of course, had this been a normal December, Glasgow would have been holding the so-called COP26 climate change conference. But obviously it's been postponed till December next year. So I thought we'd actually take a little bit of a check on what's happening on the climate change front and what would have been discussed if that conference had gone ahead this week. So I'm going to introduce my panel, but obviously I'd like to hear from you as well over the course of the next 60 minutes. The questions I suppose that I'm going to put to you are along these lines. Is the government doing enough to tackle climate change in your view? If not, what more needs to be done to tackle the problem? What practical things should we do personally to tackle the issue? But is that really more than a pinprick in what needs to be done? Doesn't it mean that actually it's governments all around the world that need to get together to take concerted action, because that's the only way that global warming can be, well, I don't know about stopped, but at least ameliorated. And what do you think we should expect from COP26 next year? What solutions do we have right here and now? What do you make of the environmental record of this government in particular? Because they've announced all sorts of green initiatives over the last year or so. And I wonder how they compare with what other governments are doing around the world. They would say that they compare very, very favourably. If you look at the carbon reductions in this country, if you look at the amount of wind power that we're using, coal power has more or less been eliminated in this country now. But how much further would you like the government to go? They've brought forward the date for the abolition of the sale of new diesel and petrol cars to 2030, which has caused some people to take notice of that. Being a complete petrol head myself, I am one of them. But you see, I have now, for the first time, thought, actually, you know, I'm seriously going to look at buying an electric car. If you had said that to me 2 years ago, I would have laughed in your face. So it's even got to me. So maybe that's a good thing, maybe not. 0345 6060 973. Right, let me introduce my panel to you. Tom Burke is chairman of E3G, Third Generation Environmentalism, and a former government advisor on climate change. He joins me in the studio. Hello, Tom.
Hi.
We've spoken many times on the phone, but never in the studio, so welcome. Juliet Davenport is a climate campaigner and chief executive and founder of one of the UK's first renewable energy companies, Good Energy. Juliet, welcome to you. And Dom Goggins is a member of the Manchester Climate Change Board and coordinator of the Parliamentary Group on Renewable and Sustainable Energy. Hi, Dom.
Hi.
And Fatima Ibrahim is co-director for Green New Deal UK. Fatima, hi to you.
Hi, good evening, Ian.
Now, just tell me, Fatima, what does Green New Deal UK mean?
So we're a campaigning organisation that's looking to build a movement around the country that takes a systemic analysis of climate change. What we want the government to do and us to recognise is that we have an economy that's built on both, you know, exploiting the environment, but also that people are not benefiting, and that there is a pathway for us living within our ecological limits while making people's everyday lives better. So one of the main things we're calling for is investment in green jobs that allows us to level up across the country and reduce our carbon emissions. So what we want is for us to have a livable future where people everywhere thrive.
Which, Juliet, I guess is kind of why you started Good Energy.
Yes, indeed. I mean, I think, yes. I mean, a vision of, I do think we need this combination of government laying out the sort of foundations and the framework that we need to operate in, business coming with entrepreneurialism and ideas and the creativity, but consumers need to absolutely be part of this conversation. We can't do it without them.
And Don Goggins, you coordinate the Parliamentary Group on Renewable and Sustainable Energy. Slight mouthful of a title, that. How do you find that parliamentarians in general react to this issue? Is there still a lot of convincing to be done?
there's actually a remarkable amount of consensus in Parliament. PRASEG, which is the acronym for the group that I run, is
PRASEG.
the biggest.
Could you not do better than that?
Well, it's a very long-standing organisation here. It's certainly been around for a lot longer than I have. But it's a big group of MPs and peers from all parties, and there's a lot of consensus, a lot of support, and there's quite a lot of momentum in Parliament around these issues at the moment.
And Tom Burke, let's go back to how I introduced the hour. In terms of international comparisons, do we have a Green government?
We have a government that's leading the world in terms of its response on climate change. I think that's right. It's done more through the Climate Change Act and through the kind of announcements it's been making recently to really give a lead. So we're ahead of the world in getting our emissions reductions down. That is something to be proud of, and it's a justifiable thing for our country to take credit for.
And what is E3G?
It stands for Third Generation Environmentalism. We're a climate change think tank, and it really marks the move, as it were, in the environmental community from campaigning to really professionals getting much more involved in delivering outcomes rather than simply making arguments.
I do want people to phone in with their views on this, but you could also phone in if you'd like to ask a question. You've heard all of our four panellists set out their stall, where they're coming from. I'm sure you'll have lots of questions for them as well. So let's rack up those calls now. 0345 6060 973. In terms of, let's start with what the individual can do as opposed to what the state can do, because the state, I think, has a problem here, because the state is quite good at sort of wielding a stick and saying, you must do this. It is less good at saying, well, if you do this, we'll give you that, or we'll encourage you to do things. Tom, do you think that's the dilemma that politicians have here?
It's not really a dilemma, because you need both. There are some things like changing the transport system, changing the energy system, where in a sense we need the state and business together to do big things for us. And it's not a large number of those big things. But then there are a huge number of small things, none of which on its own makes a big difference, but if we all do them together, they make an enormous difference. And you need to bring those two bits together in order to really solve the problem. So you can't put, as it were, the government against the people or the other way around. And so the idea of hectoring people into behaving better is not a very good approach. You need to bring out, as Juliet was saying, you need to bring out the creative in people. And we've seen throughout the virus, in all kinds of ways, just how creative can be when a challenge is in front of them.
Dom, you were nodding your head there.
Yeah, so this more from a point of view of, I sit on the Manchester Climate Change Board, and it's a big partnership effectively across the city of public institutions, businesses, civil society, and I'm the citizen rep on that board. And actually there's a lot of consultation, and it's an interesting one, because what we've found is that when people are asked, what would you like to contribute, or what would you like to do to reduce your carbon footprint as a person, often they respond with answers like, I would like to be able to use the bus if there was a good bus service and if there was a clean bus service. So actually, people's individual choices to become more environmentally friendly can be facilitated by better political decisions. And I think that's how I understand what Tom was talking about, it's not a dilemma, it's about different sectors working together and facilitating much more environmentally sound choices in the future.
Fatima, what's your view on this? Because I have this feeling that if we were having this conversation maybe 10 or 15 years ago, it would have been very different, because I think there was a much more top-down approach taken by governments, not just ours, but all over the world as well. Whereas I think people now, even if 10 or 15 years ago you were somebody who didn't really buy into all the global warming thing, I think that's changed, hasn't it?
Yeah, I totally think it's changing. I mean, I have a bit of a difficulty with the overemphasis and I think focus that we've had maybe over the last decade on individual action, not just from the government, I have to say from mainstream environmental organizations who've massively focused on, people's, using plastic bags, changing the way we live. I think that's super important, not only because that is how we're going to live in the future, and starting to develop those habits and doing that is important. But I do think it's a 20/80 split. Our ability to change how we live is limited. It was only, I think, earlier this year where I was doing interviews on the government's ban on coal, wood burning and wetwood burning. And one of the biggest pushbacks were from people in rural communities who are facing fuel poverty. He said, okay, you ban this, but we can't afford to buy an alternative. And I think that's where the government action needs to come in. People are willing to change. We've seen in this pandemic, people are willing to change and can change how they live if they have the support to do it. But there's very little the British public can do if, for example, like airlines, why is it, plane ticket much cheaper than taking the train? It's because there's subsidies in play. So I think that's where, I really do have the British public's back, where I say there's only so much we can do. We really need the government to be making it easier and cheaper for us to make those changes.
And Juliet Davenport from Good Energy, you are one of the prime movers in this, aren't you? Because you are using energy sources, and presumably all of your customers are choosing you because of that. You're using your green credentials as a way to make a profit. Nothing wrong with that at all.
I think also, what we've always set out to do is to make a change as well. So when we set up 20 years ago, I think 2% of the UK's electricity came from renewables. And part of our ambition when we set out was not just to supply those consumers with energy, but also to be a force of change in the marketplace that represented a future that would look different. And that, I think we're seeing more businesses led like this that aren't just about delivering power. They are about change and facilitating change. And I think to Fatima's point, we are in a bit of a catch-22 situation with consumers, because government doesn't necessarily believe always that consumer choice can make a difference or consumer behaviour can make a difference. And so they don't necessarily change the legislation that's needed in place to allow consumers in. But our belief has always been that consumers can be absolutely part of this. You buy a rail ticket, at peak time it costs you more, at off-peak time it costs you less. You don't get that in your energy bill. So if you're in a household, if you switch it on at 5 o'clock or you switch it on at 2 o'clock in the morning, most people don't think there's a difference between that. And that's one of the things that we could really engage with consumers and help them make sure that the system not only delivers on low carbon, but is not done in a really expensive way.
Well, lots more to talk about. We've got lots of calls coming in, which is great. 0345 6060 973. If you've got a view on what should happen maybe at next year's COP26, or you've got a question for our panel, Tom Burke, Juliet Davenport, Dom Goggins and Fatima Ibrahim, they're here with me until 10 o'clock. You're listening to LBC. I'm Ian Dale. It's 16 minutes past 9.
LBC.
20 past 9 on LBC. It's our Monday night panel. Let me reintroduce my guest. Tom Burke is chairman of E3G. Juliet Davenport is the founder of Good Energy. Dom Goggins is coordinator, what was it again? Parliamentary, I think this is hilarious. Parliamentary Group on Renewable and Sustainable Energy, and Fatima Ibrahim is from the Green New Deal UK. Now, I wasn't going to go to calls immediately, but we've got so many coming in, and they're actually going to ask questions that I was going to ask. So I'm going to start with Sean in Wembley. Sean, hi.
Hello.
Hi, what would you like to say?
Well, my main question is like, why is it always left to the government to sort it out? We've kind of got an ambitious or a certain way of living now, and it just seems like everybody's expecting a magic pill, and it just
this is an interesting one, isn't it, Tom? Because people always say, well, the government must do this or the state must intervene, whereas actually it's the government intervening, I suppose, on behalf of everybody. But if people don't buy into what the government wants to do, it's not going to work, is it?
I couldn't agree with you more. But I think there are some things that only the government can do. But what's been really interesting over the course of the last 2 or 3 years is the extent to which the investors have begun to see this as a risk issue, not a responsibility issue. And so now they're playing a much bigger part, particularly in driving forward the opportunity side of this. So investing in why the renewables cost has come down so rapidly is because the capital markets are now starting to see lots of opportunity here. But there's some of it that can only be done if people work together. And why I think it's interesting to hear from our colleague from Manchester, local government has a really big role to play in here, and we underestimate the role that local government can play in mobilising and helping people to do more for themselves.
Fatima, you were touching on this in your remarks earlier. What would you like to say to Sean?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I agree with Tom. I think we all have our part to play, but it is on the government, and there isn't a magic pill. There isn't. I'm the first to say there isn't. And I think that's why I've quite often demanded the government bring forward credible plans. It's been 5 years since the Paris Agreement, and yes, the government has done, astonishing things this year in terms of, bringing forward the phase out of diesel cars, renewing and updating their commitment to reducing carbon emissions by 2030. But they don't have a credible plan that shows us the pathway to how we're going to get there. And I think that's something we should expect from our government. We elect our leaders, we entrust them with the taxpayers' money in order to come up with plans on how we're going to transition our economy. They are responsible for our economy. But I would say the other reason why I would put pressure on the government is money is the thing that's fueling the climate crisis. And our government has the purse strings and is subsidizing fossil fuels in this country. It's subsidizing sectors of our economy that are polluting and not serving the public good. So the base demand to our government is to put money towards public goods, to put it towards sectors who actively decarbonize our economy. That's not something we have control over. No, they're not doing that. I think there's certain.
Tom is looking quizzical.
They're not doing enough of it, and they're not doing it fast enough, but they are doing quite a lot of it, actually. They're not always doing things that are right. They're sometimes doing things that are wrong, as governments often do. But they are doing stuff, but we need to do a lot more.
But, Fatima, if other countries don't buy into this, and I mean, we all know who we're talking about here. China talks a good game on climate change, but if China and India actually did what other countries are doing, they would make such a massive inroad into it, whereas smaller countries on their own can't do an awful lot. The whole idea of COP26, I guess, is to get the whole of the international community working together to a shared objective. Do you think it's realistic to expect I was going to say developing economies. That's not really the way to talk about China nowadays, is it? But the way to persuade countries that maybe haven't had a traditional industrial economy, they say, well, you've had your industrial revolution, we're having ours, and why shouldn't we? It's quite difficult to get all of these the soldiers in a row, isn't it?
It is, and that's one of the biggest responsibilities a government who's hosting the COP, particularly one that's 5 years on from Paris, has, is that part of international leadership is getting other people on board and convincing them that that they should be doubling down and that their targets should be more ambitious. But I think the government needs to get its own house in order. I think any government that's looking at the UK will, yes, see some great work, but we have historic responsibilities to go further and faster. We were the first country to industrialize. Shouldn't we be the first country to go net zero? Shouldn't we be the country that leads on the renewable energy transition? I think that's the responsibility we hold, and that's the only one that will make us credible when we're convincing other countries to do the same, particularly those who are responsible for billions of people and have a much harder task in transitioning their economy.
So your view is that the government has set out some very ambitious targets and wants to get to net zero, but you think the pathway isn't there for them to meet them?
I focus on the pathway. I think there's plenty of my colleagues who don't think the targets are ambitious or in line with our global commitments to keep global warming between 1.5 degrees, the degree to which, millions of people will be at risk of climate impacts. That's like one of the issues. Is it ambitious enough? ? The other thing is, do we have a credible pathway to get there? And the answer is categorically no. It doesn't add up. We don't have a plan that gets us to our 2030 targets. We don't have a credible plan that gets us to our... No, but we're hosting the COP next year, and I think the expectation we should have on other countries is to bring their plans, but we have to bring our own.
All right. Sean, thank you very much for that. Let's go to Shuvik in Eltham. Hi, Shuvik.
Hello there to Ian and the panel as well, of course. I think that we do have personal responsibility in terms of whether we buy cars like SUVs or not. I mean, I think men particularly have a problem with they tend to be addicted to SUV type of cars. I'd like to ask the panel about green finance. What does the panel have to say to the listeners on green finance, particularly renewable energy and green transport, electric cars, trains, buses?
Juliet Davenport from Good Energy, let's come to you on this. Green finance, it sounds a wonderful thing. What does it actually mean?
Well, I think there's various levels of green finance, obviously. So a lot of people today probably have a pension. It's part of what most of us are saving for our later life. I think one of the key things that we're beginning to see is a campaign to ask our pension funds to make sure that we are not investing in things that are destroying our planet, which actually will make our retirement slightly less pleasant. So I think we are beginning to see, as Tom mentioned earlier, some of these areas really shift. And actually, we can play a role in that. I mean, calling up your pension company, I wrote to 38 pension companies recently asking them about what their pension funds were invested in. And nearly all of them still have fossil fuels invested. So the campaign about actually trying to persuade these organisations to change where they're invested is really powerful. And then at the other end, if we look at consumer investment and sort of what we're investing in personally, I think is also really important. So the Green Deal, the sort of green grants that we've seen coming out, which are allowing people to invest in greening up their own homes and improving their energy efficiency, putting insulation into their lofts. All those things, again, are really good steps.
What's been the take-up of those, though?
Sorry?
What's been the take-up of those?
As yet, I don't think there's a lot of data that's come out on that. I think it's still sort of in its ramp-up process. But I also think, I don't know about you, but it's quite difficult to get hold of anybody. Everybody is trying to do something on their house at the moment. I think there's been huge booms in home improvement since lockdown, because everybody's now in their houses deciding that they're a bit colder than they thought they were. But so I don't think there's data out on that, but it's a really good question. That's something we should be asking for, is actually how effective are some of these actions.
And in terms of your own company, I switched my energy supplier a few years ago, and I deliberately chose a tariff that I thought was a green tariff. Now, I wasn't doing it to virtue signal. I just thought it was the right thing to do. Are you finding that more and more people are doing this?
Yeah, I think something like 14 million people in the UK are on green tariffs today. I mean, and that's one of the things we do have to do, is protect consumers as they start to make green choices, whether it's about a green tariff or whether it's about a promise on a kind of a new technology and what it can deliver from a carbon reduction point of view. We need to make sure we protect consumers, because currently there are no guidance or guidelines from the regulator exactly what is a green tariff and what it consists in it and what that company will do for you if you sign up to a green tariff. And I think this is, going forward, this is one of the areas we're really keen to see, is as we ask consumers to be part of this marketplace defined by government, then actually they really need protected, because they do expect to be protected.
Juliet, thank you for that. Dom Goggins, I can assure you I haven't forgotten you. We'll come to you in a few minutes' time, but it's time
on LBC.
25 to 10 on LBC. Tom Burke is here, Juliet Davenport, Dom Goggins and Fatima Ibrahim I here too, taking your calls and hearing your views. Shuvik in Eltham was asking about green finance. Dom Goggins, give us your views on what green finance can achieve.
Well, I think that Juliet's points were very well made. What I would say is that there's a couple of bits to this. I mean, partly about, whether the money that's flowing around the system supports dirty energy or clean energy, and in terms of pension funds, etc. That's what Juliet was talking about. But I think there's an element of it which actually comes back to Sean's question about, why is the government got to be so active on green issues, and part of it is about the big economic levers or the big signals that only government can send or only government can pull. So, for example, today we've had something called the Energy White Paper, which a lot of the industry has been waiting for. And, that sends a big signal that the shift to net zero in the power sector, in transport, in buildings and homes is a serious one. And actually what that signal says to investors is that the UK is open for business on issues like this. So, for example, the transition to green transport, there is plenty of opportunity for investment. There's plenty of opportunity for building new businesses and new industry. And I think if you look at the whole of the car industry, you've been talking about your own potential choice to shift to an electric vehicle, maybe a little bit further down the line. But with the targets that have been set about no new petrol or diesel engines on the road, or sold on the market after 2030, what we're talking about is an overall net benefit in terms of jobs of around 15,000 jobs, and a potential industry taken together worth about £8 billion to the UK economy. So you've got things related to the way that the money in the system right now is invested, but you've also got the way that government sends signals to allow investment to flow even further into projects which are going to speed the energy transition with big economic paybacks for the UK and real good quality, high-paying jobs in communities like mine in the north of England that haven't had too many jobs like that for a while.
Okay. Tom, you just want to do a quick word.
Well, just that we tend to think of innovation in this area as being about technology, but actually one of the big barriers to people playing the part they could play is the upfront cost of doing the things they need to do in their homes. And that's where financial innovation could make a real difference. And if we set up the kind of infrastructure bank that the government has been talking about, then we'd be able in a position to really ease the path of a lot of these ideas by allowing people to pay back over a long period of time, as they do in a mortgage, from the savings on their energy bills, the things that help us decarbonise our economy. So we need some financial innovation as well as technological innovation.
Okay, Shuvik, thank you for that. Let's go to John in Haringey. Hello, John.
Hi there. Good evening, everyone. My question is, I've got two. I think one of the reasons why our emissions have gone down is because we've exported a lot of our emissions, outsourced them to China. So we're buying stuff from China. So that's why China has very large emissions, is because it's manufacturing all the stuff we're importing because we're no longer making it. So my proposal would be to create a zero waste economy, a circular economy where we make stuff here, and then when we make it, design things so they're repairable and so they don't end up in landfill. I read somewhere that only 40% of the aluminium we use in this country is recycled. Most of it is lost. Why don't we have 100% recycling of aluminium? Because that's very energy intensive. So I think one solution is definitely to have a circular economy and to eliminate all forms of waste. And food is another example of where we're wasting a huge amount. And if we eliminated that...
You're sounding quite utopian, but if you...
Is it utopian?
Well, I don't know. From the point of view that if you look at white goods, for example, I'm sure that 20 or 30 years ago, if you bought a fridge, you would expect it to last for 10 or 15 years. Nowadays, if you buy a fridge, you expect it to last for 5. That is not advancement, is it?
Designed obsolescence. They're deliberately doing that so that we keep buying new fridges.
But how can you change that? How can you say to companies, can you legislate for that? Fatima Ibrahim, John, hang on a sec. Fatima Ibrahim, is that something that you could do to legislate for companies to make things that would last longer? I'm not sure how it's possible.
I mean, I'm not sure how it's possible. I'm sure that there are government regulations that can ensure the quality of goods and the life the long life that they have. But I definitely agree with the caller that, we need shorter supply chains. We need to be making more things closer to home. They need to be having, longer life and, after their life, thinking about how we recycle them and how they stay in that circular economy. I think that's like one of the big tasks that we have as global society is how looking at how things are made and how they're used and making sure that we're not just, extracting more resources and expecting them to then go to landfills and then extracting more. That's just not going to be possible.
Dom, we're all in Western societies. Inevitably, we've got used to a high standard of living. Generally, I mean, obviously, lots of exceptions to that, but generally, we all want the latest TVs, we want the latest fridges, and all the technical gadgets. Have we got to start to wean ourselves off all of this sort of thing?
I think John, the caller, made some pretty important points about throwaway culture, and that's something I think we do need to reassess. I've certainly not intended to come on your show tonight and tell people how they should live their lives. We've got no intention of doing that. But I think, faced with the evidence, there are choices, relatively small choices in our lives that we can make around things like the amount of red meat that we eat and the way that we choose to move around. I think, as a whole, as more of a cultural issue than anyone's individual choice, I think it would be positive if we were slightly less throwaway in the way that we approach products. But actually, I think there is a point about the circular economy, and there's a point about the outsourcing of certain things in this, in consideration of these issues, that I think John's question taps into. And it's similar actually to something that Tom was talking about before with the National Infrastructure Bank. We've got 30 million buildings in this country, and about 24 million of them are homes, and they are going to have to be decarbonised over the next decades. And that means two things. It means retrofitting those houses so they're much more efficient and they hold heat better, and it means changing the way that those homes are heated. Now, it's going to take real people doing real jobs to achieve that, and they aren't jobs that can be outsourced. And actually, I think this agenda offers us some real big economic wins. And whatever rhetoric you want to use about the levelling up agenda, or the north-south divide, or whatever it is, like, they are jobs in every community in the UK. And I think there's a big opportunity to make sure that there are big wins for every part of the UK on this agenda.
Okay, John, thank you for that. And thanks to John in Haringey for the question. Text question here from Chris in Burnham. Some countries like South Africa are virtually 100% reliant on fossil fuels just to keep the lights on. Their economy is dependent upon coal mining, and in turn their coal-fired power stations, and will be dependent on them for decades to come. For many countries, there are just no alternatives. Juliet Davenport, is that true, or is it up to maybe organisations like the World Bank to help countries like South Africa find alternatives?
I think I do think there are alternatives, and right now, if you look at the price of solar is the cheapest technology to install from scratch today. So I think you're right. We need to make sure we're engaging with the World Bank. If you look at countries like, Vietnam is going to be maybe not take over from China as being sort of a manufacturing hub, but their choice now is, as they expand, do they build, I think they had earmarked 39 new coal power stations, or do they start to actually use some of the natural resources in that country already? And I think our job here is to use all our diplomatic capability as a country, but also when we support companies or we support countries in terms of this transition, we make sure it is to a low carbon. So we start to give really strong indicators. We can lead that as the UK, particularly coming up to COP26, to really demonstrate diplomatically that this is not acceptable to be installing new coal power stations today.
Finbar asked me, Ian, what the hell are you doing to your fridges? Tom Burke, on that question about South Africa.
Yeah.
This is a difficult one for countries like Britain, isn't it? Because if we start lecturing people, we're accused of being sort of pseudo-colonialist. And it's all very well for us, we're being one of the richest countries in the world, to say, well, look, we're doing this, so why can't you?
I couldn't agree with you more, and I think that's one of the wicked problems we've not really yet faced up to. Not so much with South Africa, which is a technically well-developed country and could deploy the technologies that Juliet points out really are there. There really are alternatives. But countries like Mozambique, for instance, which has got its only resource endowment is a lot of gas, or even countries like Egypt with gas, where it's hard put to see what else they've got to do. So we're going to have to do more, not so much for their energy policy, but how to help them make the transition economically. One thing you mentioned, in a sense, in terms of what happens in this country is also true in the world. This won't work if it's unfair. So it's not just, it's got to be fair to engage people in this country, it's got to be fair to engage countries around the world in making it work. So I think we need to do better about helping some of those countries where their resource endowment is fossil fuels, how to make the transition. But we don't need to help Russia make the transition. Russia's got an economy very dependent on fossil fuels, but it's also wealthy enough and technically competent enough to make that transition itself, the same with Saudi Arabia. So we need to focus our attention on those places that really need help and be prepared to help them, which in a sense, you know, is what was a shame, that we cut back our commitment to overseas aid, because that did put Britain in a really leading position to make sure that the rest of the world was able, as well as willing, to sort of follow us.
Joe in Norfolk says, Ian, I've had my washing machine 10 years and my Creda tumble dryer for 45 years, both still as good as new. Joe, there's always one. It's 9:46.
Ian Dale, call 0345 6060 973.
10 to 10 on LBC. Tom Burke is chairman of E3G. Juliet Davenport is chief executive and founder of Good Energy. Juliet, you have a fan on a text here. Juliet Davenport, what a great Earth ambassador you are. Well, there we go. That's nice, isn't it? I think all our panel should be given that accolade as well. Dom Goggins is a member of the Manchester Climate Change Board and coordinator of the Parliamentary Group on Renewable and Sustainable Energy. I have to take a breath after that. Fatima Ibrahim is co-director of Green New Deal UK. Harry is in Waltham Forest. Harry, what would you like to say?
Good evening, Ian. Good evening, panel. What are the panel's thoughts on recent research that shows it takes far more, or rather generates far more carbon dioxide to produce an electric vehicle than to produce the equivalent diesel or petrol?
Tom?
It was wrong. The research was wrong, yeah. It was, and that's been very comprehensively debunked to show that it was wrong.
So why was it published then?
You'll have to ask the editors.
Well, I mean, it was commissioned by Honda. Are you sort of hinting that there might have been a little bit of undue influence?
I'm not hinting that, but that has been reported by lots of people.
That'll keep our lawyers happy. Dom Goggins, what do you make of that?
I agree with Tom's answer to the question. I think I understand the question from Harry for sure. I think when research like that is put out and it comes with a marker of credibility, then it can raise people's, it raise questions for people. But it was wrong. And over the life cycle of the vehicle, looking at a combustion engine, you're looking at about 26 tons of CO2, in the life cycle of an electric vehicle, you're looking at about 3.8. And that's not an entirely zero carbon solution, but it is a massive improvement.
But Juliet Davenport, what about, you can't recycle an electric vehicle car battery, can you? That's fairly environmentally unfriendly.
I think this is one of the areas that we need far more. I mean, so one of the areas I look at is innovation and research, and we very much focused on trying to produce these new technologies. And there was a question about the circular economy earlier. I think we've spent less time kind of considering how we can get them back into recycling, how we can get them back, the batteries back into the economy. And if you use a battery in a car, you can actually then use it as a static battery afterwards. So what we've seen is you can reuse them. You may not be able to completely recycle them, but you can reuse them in a different type of activity. And I think this is the area that I would like to see more innovation and investment by governments in, to really kind of paint a future for batteries are fantastic. We need more of them, but we also need to think about the total life cycle on them.
Fatima, electric cars, are they really the answer, or are they only literally about a quarter of the way to the answer?
They're part of the answer. I think if I'm being honest with you and the callers, the truth is that our maybe obsession with technologies that let us live exactly the way that we were living before isn't the way that we're going to combat the climate crisis. Every single person who has a diesel car replacing their car with an electric vehicle isn't going to be, I mean, that still has a material requirement that we're going to need resources to create those cars. Instead, what we should be doing is investing in public transport. More people should be able to travel to work and travel
that's
around.
so simplistic, isn't it? But if you
No, it is.
if you live in an urban centre, absolutely fine. If you live on the North Norfolk coast, I'm sorry, a car is not a luxury; it's a necessity.
Exactly. So me living in North London, maybe I shouldn't be, I mean, I don't have a car, but if I had a car, shouldn't be shopping it in for an electric vehicle, and maybe making sure that the local transport system is something that effectively allows me to go about my day. But if you're living in a rural community, if you're living in a community that doesn't have the necessary transport links to get you from A to B in a realistic amount of time, yes, electric vehicles is part of the way, but we're very behind on greening our public transport systems. And I think there's a lot we could be doing to make them more affordable, to make them more efficient, to allow us to get on with our days. So I do think electric vehicles and that kind of technology is going to be important to make sure there isn't a major disruption in the short term in us being able to live to the standard of living that we've become accustomed to. But it's only one part of the solution. And this is where we come full circle, that we are going to have to change the way that we live. Not all of us in the same ways, but we are definitely going to have to, travel in different ways, travel less. Maybe more of us will be working from home, and this year has shown us that we can do that.
That is a really good point, because of course in normal circumstances I would have wanted all four of you in the studio, but now we realise that we can still do a really good programme, but we've only got one of you in the studio and the three of you operating remotely, which a year ago we would never have thought of doing. We would not have done it a year ago. So we've helped save the planet tonight. That's great, isn't it? Harry, thank you for that. Let's go to VJ in Stanmore. Hello, VJ.
Hello, Ian. Thank you for taking my call. Good evening, panel. Good evening, Ian. The key question is, how do we encourage businesses to use standards, environmental standards, that will benefit them? Obviously they'll always say, well, what's in it for me? What's in it for the business? The bottom line. How can it help the bottom line if we use standards such as ISO 14001 environmental standard? Do you have any thoughts on that? How to encourage them?
Right, we've literally got 2 minutes left, so I'm going to ask you for 30 seconds each, starting with you, Tom.
We're not going to solve this problem without effective profit-making businesses. We really aren't. They're where innovation comes from. They're where, if you're going to deliver solutions, business is going to do it. But business can't do it if it's not given the right framework of policy by government.
Juliet.
I think it's really exciting to see where we're seeing businesses really take a lead. You've got people like Apple pledging carbon neutrality for all its supply chain. Some of the biggest cement companies in India, I think, now committing to zero carbon. So companies are up for it. They really want to be part of this solution. And I agree with Tom. We then need governments to make sure they've got the framework to be able to deliver that.
I think you've just had an email saying, Juliet, you're on the radio. Dom Goggins.
I agree with Tom and Juliet about regulation. But I would say to VJ that, when it comes to sound commercial choices for the long term are by definition also going to be environmental sustainable choices. So, and there are basic things that businesses can do as part of their ordinary cycle. So, for example, if you're running a business and your energy tariff is up and you're currently on a fossil fuel-based tariff, switch to a renewable tariff. It's the right thing to do. It's also cheaper because it's a cheaper form of energy.
30 seconds, please.
Yeah, I agree too. I think private finance follows public finance, but one thing that we haven't talked about tonight is skills and training. Businesses need to employ people, and we have a huge skills gap in this country in terms of the skills required for the green economy. So we definitely need to be skilling up people so that they can take up these jobs all over the country and benefit and thrive from the green economy. So I think we need to be investing in training and skilling for those people that need to live there.
Thank you very much to all four of you. Tom Burke, Juliet Davenport, Dom Goggins, Fatima Ibrahim, who said climate change could not be fun. They were wrong, weren't they? I'll be back tomorrow from 7 on LBC. Coming up at 1.